I'll start by telling you a bit about myself. I've been very interested in, my professional work is in the area of English and literacy, and I've been involved with education and teacher education for about 40 years. My background was a literature and history degree, a long time ago. And very early on in my teaching career, I've always had a passion for literature, but I also became very interested in popular culture. When I started teaching, I was teaching students, some of whom loved reading and loved books, but a lot of whom didn't. But I was very interested in what they did like and what they were watching. And from that, my interest in popular culture as multimedia texts and as part of the kind of spectrum of reading that children do grew. And some years later, I started to become aware of a couple of children I knew in particular who were avid readers but who were also really enjoying playing computer games. And I was curious because these kids were very thoughtful, sparky, smart kids, and they were being sufficiently engaged by the games that they were playing to spend huge amounts of time with them, but it didn't seem to be undercutting their reading of print texts. And so I started to look at one of the games that one in particular was playing, which was the first Prince of Persia, which now looks very two-dimensional. But at that time, it was an eye-opener for me because it seemed to me that it was such an interesting narrative, and the ways in which the players were being involved was very interesting, similar and different from reading. The ways in which the game was working as a visual text was similar and different from film. And it seemed to me that so many of the things that I knew about reading and I knew about representation and interpretation and narrative and complexity, that was all happening in the ways in which the game was unfolding, the ways in which the children were playing the game and making the game happen. So I began then to be interested in video games as examples of multimodal texts and to look at the ways in which players were engaging with narrative, what narrative was like in this kind of context. A whole set of issues to do with their sense of identity and the ways in which people represented themselves online. And as time went on and as games became more sophisticated and more complex, and we started to have multiplayer games and people would have an online presence, I, through a series of projects with terrific teachers and schools and kids, became interested in the ways in which students, young people, teenagers, online and in the games world were doing lots of the things that they would be doing normally, so how am I going to, what sort of person am I going to present myself as? How am I going to respond when somebody says something kind of that's a bit confronting? I remember one boy who I was particularly fascinated to hear about talked about how before he played the game, he skilled himself up so that when he entered the game, he would already enter at a high level of skill so people would make judgments about him, that he was a good player. And he talked about how he put a lot of time and thought into the forums and the discussion around the game so that he could affect or shape a bit the ways in which the sort of relationships he had online and the presence he had online. I just thought that was fascinating. The first couple of projects big research projects I was involved with were looking particularly at multimodal literacy, at representation, at identity in various contexts. And towards the end of the, or not really towards the end, in the course of one of them, there began to be a much greater interest in computer games and video games and learning. And I guess this coincided pretty much with a book that was published by a very influential literacy theorist in America, Jim G., who talked about the ways in which video games embodied good learning principles. And from that point, which I suppose about early 2000s, there became a growing interest internationally really in the potential of games to support learning. So my current work is looking, still with a strong literacy component, but it's looking at the ways in which games can be used to support learning in school, but also the ways in which kids learn and play and enjoy games outside of school. So Serious Play, the project Serious Play came about in part as a direct outcome of a previous project which had been looking particularly at literacy, and it partly because there was a growing interest in what people would call serious games, a growing interest in the use of the interactions between games and learning, a growing awareness of the kinds of opportunities that games provide to understand things in specific kinds of ways, and a lot of rhetoric around about young people as digital natives, and teachers as being out of touch, and young people as being utterly in touch, and schools as being places that could be transformed if only, you know, we tuned into students. And while there seem to be elements of truth in many components of this, it also seemed to me to be quite at odds with what I knew about schools and what I knew about teachers and what I knew about kids, and the diversity and the complexity of what people do. So part of the concern with the Serious Play project was to actually look a little more closely at what kinds of learning, what kinds of opportunities, what kinds of circumstances, what kinds of games, what kinds of kids, what kind of teachers. So just to kind of make it much messier and get closer to the ways in which things were actually happening, and also to recognise and support the good things that were already happening. So that was the sort of impetus for it. The title Serious Play, it's not an original phrase, although I find it a very evocative one. I first came across it in the work of some Canadian scholars, Suzanne de Castell and Jennifer Jensen, who published a very influential paper called Serious Play in the Journal of Curriculum Studies. But the idea really of serious play is, I suppose, there are several layers, but one is the notion that play is not necessarily frivolous, play is not necessarily trivial or inconsequential, that actually we can do some pretty profound learning through play, and of course that's what babies are doing all the time. So it's partly the notion that play can actually be quite profound, and it's partly the notion that, partly picking up also that idea of serious, and serious is people get very, it's very hard to define the notion of serious play or serious games. Serious games is a term that's used to describe particular kinds of games that are designed to teach subjects in schools. Generally speaking, they're quite different from commercial games or popular games. There are some wonderful examples, but there are some also a very large number of pretty deadly examples. So it was partly an idea, partly that term was also trying to just ruffle the notion of serious games a little bit. So it's looking at both play and games. That's the origin of the term. The claim that teachers need something in their arsenal, anything in their arsenal, to counter apathy is a somewhat black-humoured way of talking about, I think, the concern that many teachers feel that the challenge that we all have all the time, really, to engage students and to help them be excited and committed to their learning is a perennial issue and pressure. And my guess is that it's centuries old, really, but we may not have been so tuned into it. So part of the impetus for serious play was also to look at the ways in which teachers might make use of the tremendous commitment that our students make to games, and the great pleasure that games can impart, but also the kinds of challenge and the sorts of growth that games make possible. And we know that for very many young people, digital games are an important part of their world. It's not to say they are for all children, but it's a place where students who might not find school particularly engaging or motivating will nonetheless spend a great deal of time working out quite complex problems, interacting with people, working out strategies, and generally kind of, I guess, stretching and growing within that context. With the Serious Play project, we wanted to explore these possibilities with teachers. The teachers in the project, when we were setting up the project, we approached a number of schools and asked if they were interested to be part of it in Queensland, and 6 schools said yes, they thought there was lots of potential there, and that they would be very interested to explore ways of engaging students with games and ways of teaching using games. In Victoria, we were fortunate to work again with the Education Department, who had supported us in previous projects, and there were a number of teachers in Victoria who already knew something about the potential of games to support learning. So in a sense what we had was a mixed group of teachers, some of whom were already very positive and interested in the opportunities that games present, and also some of the challenges in ways to work the best with them, and other teachers for whom this was an open book, who hadn't worked in this way before but were very interested and open to find ways to support this and extend their students' learning. When we first started working with the teachers and the students, engaging with digital games, in this current project, in the Serious Play project, one of our concerns was that we might not find a sufficient range of games, or that the teachers might not find ways of find games that they felt had a great deal to offer their students. So one of them was that we wouldn't be able to find good games. A related one was that the teachers would find some of the challenges too time-consuming or too difficult or too problematic to see the benefit. Thinking about the kinds of challenges that we faced or some of the troubles that arose, I was mostly working with teachers in the Queensland schools, and teachers in the Queensland schools by and large hadn't had a great deal of experience with working with digital games. Some of them had, but for many of them this was an open book and something that they wanted to explore and find out about, but they were also very conscious of their commitments to the school, to the curriculum, to the formal requirements of the Queensland Education Department and so on. So some of the troubles arose, or potential troubles arose, when we were trying to find games or trying to teach in ways that would enable the teachers to meet the curriculums. The teachers that I was working with in Queensland, many of them had not had a great deal of experience with games, but some of them had. And as with all things, their work didn't always go smoothly. So there was one example of an English teacher who hadn't been teaching very long, but who was working with a group of kids who were by and large not particularly engaged with schools, and she became quite excited about a game called Mist, which had been used elsewhere as a wonderful kind of incentive for students' creative writing. And this is quite a well-known game. And so she set about installing that at her school, getting licenses and so on. But after quite a deal of trouble, it turned out she couldn't install that on the school's computers because there were software systems blocking it at the school level, but behind that, more at a state level, out of concern, I suppose, to protect students from improper use of games or improper games. But in this case, it worked against her because there was this systemic block that wouldn't allow her to install it. A different example was a teacher who was working with a group of kids, and he was in the making games area. We had 3 layers in the project. One was using pre-existing games to learn in subject areas. One was making games, and one was critiquing or analysing games. So the English teacher obviously was wanting to use the games to support the kids' literacy and writing. The other teacher that I mentioned, he was working with making games, and he was getting his students to make games as a way of meeting the learning outcomes of his subject area. And the boys made fabulous things. He was doing teaching in a boys' school. It was terrific, the games that they made. But in his case, that was fine that first year, but in the following year, there was a change of organisation at the school, which required all students to do much more commonality across all the classes in that year level in that subject area. And because the other teachers wouldn't be able to replicate what he had done, and he couldn't split himself all those many ways in order to be able to repeat that experience, he wasn't able to take that particular game-making approach to meeting the objectives to the following year. It was very interesting for us when we were setting up this project to see how much more open and interested schools and systems were to the opportunities that games presented than they had been when we'd done a similar project 5 years previously. When we began the previous project in 2007, we had some difficulty in convincing schools and teachers that it was worth taking a risk on this and exploring the ways in which games might support learning, in that case in a range of areas related to literacy. When it came to the Serious Play project, which began in 2011 but we were putting together in 2010, I was very surprised at how much more interest and awareness there was about the potential for games to support learning. Whereas previously we had, although we had an agreement with the Education Department, obviously within the Education Department, as one of our partners, and the English Teachers Association was another, and the Australian Centre for the Moving Image was a third. So amongst those three groups there was a lot of interest, but we needed, of course, to work with teachers who wanted to work with us. And we had a fabulous team in the end, but it took quite a long time before that happened. In the case of serious play, we were fortunate to be able, in Victoria, to continue our work with the Education Department. And in that instance, all the teachers in the project, only one school had worked with us previously, but all the teachers in that project and all the schools in that project already knew about games and had already done something and were very keen to continue. In the case of Queensland, quite a different kind of context, but nonetheless significant interest. In Queensland, rather than work with the Education Department, we had buy-in from 6 separate schools. Now these schools were part of people we knew through professional networks, but I was really surprised and excited and impressed really by the level of interest and buy-in that there was. And I think that's partly to do with that video games have become much more respectable than they were. Partly maybe because just as people who were playing as children have become teachers, they know that, or become, part of education systems, are aware that there might be something there. I'm not entirely sure why, but I think it's quite significant that there's a level of enthusiasm and interest. And certainly in our case, we had moved from, in the previous project, to focus on literacy, so we were looking at multi-literacies really, in things like English and drama and media. But here we were looking right across the curriculum area. So we were looking at the ways in which people might use games to support learning in the subject areas. We were looking at the ways in which people might have kids making and creating games. And we were looking at the ways in which people might work with kids to help them become kind of more critically evaluative of games. In both projects we were also very conscious that the kinds of ways in which kids play outside of school and the world of games outside of school is completely different, and that it's not the case necessarily that you get a direct transfer. So in both cases we've also, a significant part of the project has been for us, as far as possible, to learn more about the kinds of pleasures and engagement and so on that's going on out of school. So those 3 areas, in fact, using games to support learning, making games and analysing games, they structured the kinds of activities that we offered to teachers and the schools. And I think that meant that we got a really, I hope it meant that for the teachers there was a good range of things that they might want to take up. The way it worked out in practice was we had a really wide range of subject areas covered, a wide range of games used or explored, and a wide range of year levels. So they went right down to the lower primary school and up to about year 9 or 10. But I think that one of the things that was very exciting and rewarding during the course of the project was to see over the 3 years the ways in which the teachers saw the games as ways to enable them to meet the kind of goals and hopes that they had originally, but also to go further. And it was, I suppose part of what I was hoping would happen would be that people would not fall into the trap of thinking, here is a game I put in front of my kids and it's a textbook and off we go. Now, I don't know why I ever thought that, because the teachers we worked with were wonderful, but a lot of the rhetoric or the writing around it suggests that if you bring games into the classroom, that students will be highly motivated and that they'll learn. Well, that's true to a degree, but the last thing you want is for just an unproblematic acquisition of content knowledge or skill and drill, when the potential of games is so much more. You know, the potential of games to enable students to explore, to discover, to take responsibility, to imaginatively enter the world of the game is enormous. And for me, one of the most exciting aspects of the project that I witnessed, that I was involved with, was the work that one of the schools did with a game that our partner investigator Yam Sanchi, Professor Yam Sanchi from Singapore, had developed, which was a citizenship game. And the thinking behind the citizenship game was that students would actually become members of the particular society, and that they would enter into that world imaginatively, completely, and that through the course of challenges presented in the games that they would come to quite rich and complex understandings of many aspects of governance and citizenship. And I suppose if I was thinking what I would most want for all our teachers to have, it's that sense of awareness and valuing of that imaginative entry into the world that they're exploring, and also I suppose to have the opportunity to work with fabulous games, whether it's ones such as Statecraft X, which this game was, or whether it's one such as Minecraft, and very many of our teachers have done lovely things with Minecraft. So I would wish them great games to work with, but also ways of teaching that enable students to really enlarge and develop and deepen their understanding both of the subject area and of themselves. One of the main reasons why we set up Serious Play was that I became increasingly concerned about the ways in which people particularly were talking about games, as if games were kind of like teacher-proof textbooks that could transform your curriculum, that all you needed to do was get a game, pop it in your class, that all your students would be avid players, and that games would give them everything they need. This seemed to me to be a travesty, really, of what teaching and learning is about. I certainly went to a number of conferences where some studies prided themselves on being able to teach this particular area without the teacher needing to be involved at all. One that struck me in particular was an example of a physics game, and the people who were talking about this game talked about that the only problems were these girls that just didn't get it and what a nuisance they were. So there's a way of thinking about games that treats them as though they will package up curriculum and deliver it in ways that are complete, sealed. I worry about what happens to learning, I worry about what happens to reflection, I worry about what happens to the very many different ways in which kids engage with anything that you give them. And I also worry about the versions of the curriculum or the versions of the content that games purport to deliver. The best games, and like the best teaching, are open and flexible, promote all sorts of kind of thinking and questioning and deep conceptual understanding. That's much more difficult to achieve than a skill and drill practice of a set of activities or a narrowly simplistic version of what a subject area is. There's also, when people do research about games in schools, one of the things that's hardest, that again and again and again, is hardest to achieve is to get a match between what the games offer and what schools and curriculums offer. And the higher up you go through the school, the harder this becomes to achieve. So there's a kind of a great temptation, I think, for games makers, or there are commercial opportunities, let me put it that way. There appear to be commercial opportunities to come up with a perfect packaged game, but I think there are very few that actually achieve this. And if you look at the best and most powerful games-based learning, it tends to be with games that are fairly open, games that invite deep imaginative entry, and so far really are taught by teachers who are fairly experienced with games and who are open to building in reflection. Now, not all of our teachers were experienced with games, but they were all very open to explore the possibilities. I'm concerned that games will be presented as the perfect solution. I'm concerned that content might be reduced, or curriculum might be reduced to content that can be measured through tick-the-box kind of answers. And I'm concerned that assumptions are made that everything that happens out of school can be unproblematically transferred into school. Part of what makes people so interested in games, I think, is that we're aware that out of school, in people's leisure time, games offer a very rich experience and a very rich community often, and all sorts of learning goes on in an informal kind of way. And it's very tempting to wish we could get this in schools as well. But learning in school with digital games and learning out of school or engaging with digital games are quite different. There are some commonalities, there are some overflow, obviously, but I think we need to take care not to assume that the environment doesn't matter and the purpose doesn't matter. That when you're playing games at home and you're playing games with your friends or people you've never met, you're doing it in a way that is when you feel like doing it. You can do it for as long as you like or as little as you like. As you do it, you're connecting up with friends, you're achieving all sorts of things, apart from just winning at the game or losing at the game. You're speaking with your mates, or you're trying out a particular persona, or you're having fun in that narrative world, or that solving those problems, engaging in that action. In school, some of those things can still happen, but in school you're likely to be doing things for different reasons, with different people. It's much more constrained. So I think that there's lots of possibilities, but it is different. And I do think that the context in which we do things changes how we experience that, changes how we relate to it quite significantly. So for me, a really important component in establishing serious play was for teachers to be able to work with games in ways that didn't, with games that weren't like open and shut textbooks, and in ways that allowed teachers to have lots of space themselves to explore. In Queensland, we were working with teachers, by and large, who didn't have a huge background or experience in games. There were some notable exceptions. One of the teachers I'm thinking of was a literacy teacher who didn't have much experience of this at all, but she discovered the game Ratchet and Clank. Now, Ratchet and Clank is a pretty small game, not one that you would think of as an educational game, but with her students in, I think, grade 2 or grade 3, she started to use this to teach them to write stories. So they would play the game and write episodes or imagine what Ratchet and Clank would do next. So this game, which was quite a small self-contained game, not a textbook I have to say, but a small self-contained game, this teacher was able to kind of take and open up and explore and find ways with her kids for them to really extend and enrich their narrative writing. That was a great example for me of the ways in which a game which wasn't an educational game particularly, in fact at all, in fact I think the Ratchet and Clank makers might die of shock if they knew what had happened, really became a fabulous vehicle when she used it to address some needs that she was aware of within the literacy curriculum. Another example of a serious game, quite a small one, happened in some of the social studies classes with Year 8 students, where there was a game called Sweatshop and another game called Aiti. And in Aiti, I think it's Aiti, it's quite a short game, but you have a family who they're in a rural community, and there is very little resources. They're dependent on the crops. They're dependent on the weather. They're dependent on the prices that the goods will fetch. And the challenge is for this family just to survive. And so you have parents and children, and if you try to send the children to school, then you run out of money, and it's very, very challenging to work out how to actually survive a year, because it's clear that education is the way to enable people to get to a better economic future. But if you try to educate all the children, you starve. And people get sick and so on. So it's a very small game, and it's got quite a clear point, I guess. But even just that little small game enables you to have quite a complicated and insightful sense of the challenges that people in third world countries might face. Now, the ways in which the teachers that were working with that game were using it was they put the class into small teams, and the students would all try and get their family through. When their family didn't get through to the end, then there would be the chance to kind of talk and reflect. So that was, I suppose, that game in a way was sort of like a textbook in as much as it was teaching quite a explicit and coherent point, but it was really a set of conceptual understandings and a set of relationships which became apparent through what the kids did or what the players did. rather than a structured curriculum. So the mix of that game and also the ways in which the teachers were using it enabled it to be much more open than a textbook. Part of my concern more generally with some of the games that are out there that present themselves as solutions is that they don't provide this sort of space for teachers to kind of get in and mess around and for kids to kind of drop in and drop out. The schools in the project, the 10 schools in the project, we've come to formally the end of the 3-year involvement that these teachers have had with the project, and I know some of them are interested to move on to other things, and that some of them are very have changed the ways in which they teach and are interested to keep on exploring the use of digital games. Our formal connection with the schools has finished, at least for the time being. We're in the process of putting together a book that we hope will crystallise many of the things that we've learnt through the project, and that we'll also talk about much of the work that the teachers in the schools and the students have done. In both Queensland and Victoria, there's a great deal of interest in both serious games in general and serious games in schools, and also in the work that this project has done and that teachers in this project have done. At the moment, everything's a little bit open. Certainly there are networks in both states that are keen to do more. I guess for us, the immediate work is to make the findings, I suppose, of this research available not just to these teachers in these schools, but to other teachers more generally. So there's a moving out, I suppose, from the work that was done in the schools and the work that the teachers and students did to inform other teachers and other systems, and indeed other countries. So part of it is to say, you've done great things, let's put it out there. In terms of continuing to work with individual schools, that's much more open and fluid. And I think it's probably at the moment, it'll vary according to different teachers, the degree to which they follow up these things on their own account. There are some teachers, I can think of some in Victoria and also in Queensland, who were already doing fabulous things, that this was kind of like a boost, this was a bit of, wind under their wings, if you like, to take them to the next step of whatever it is they're going to do. There are other teachers from other parts of Queensland and Victoria who I think are keen to learn more about what these teachers have done. To my knowledge, in Queensland, if I think of the people in the Queensland schools, there are some of those people who have moved on into different spaces. There are others who will, I think, continue to explore the use of games in their own classrooms. At the end of our day with the teachers in Queensland, at the end of last year, Michael Deswani, one of the project investigators, said to the teachers, were we with you in your schools too much? And I said to the teachers, were we with you in your schools enough? And so I think for different teachers in different schools, some will welcome the opportunity to be on their own, get back to whatever it was they were doing before, or doing things on their own term. For other teachers, they'll find it maybe difficult to keep going without external people saying, look, here's a good game, or have you thought about this? I think there'll be a third group of teachers for whom their teaching has changed a bit as a result of being involved in the project, and who'll continue to explore in their own terms. We don't at the moment have a formal commitment or next stage of serious play in Queensland or Victoria, although of course we're very much exploring other ways of working with games in schools. What I think should happen next is that the teachers, those teachers who find this interesting and exciting and invigorating, whether they're in our project schools or whether they're in other schools in Queensland or Victoria or other states or internationally, that growing community of people that are interested in games and very excited about the possibilities should take this further. It seems to me that there's fabulous opportunities for networking, that there's really very rich time now for us to explore. I'm stunned by the level of interest there is, both here and internationally, and I feel like the Serious Play project was part of a network of research across the world that's doing wonderful things. In Victoria last year, the year before, I was fortunate to work with a couple of health games developed by Canadian scholars with a high school looking at health education. We learned heaps doing that. When we had a forum last year in September with some international games-based learning speakers and many visitors from within Queensland and elsewhere, there were many, many, many stories about people using their games in schools. So I think we're at a time where this really is becoming possible, but I also think it's a time when it's really, really important for us to think very critically and carefully about the ways in which games can be used to support the best kind of teaching and learning. So in my ideal world, in my dream world, where we would be now would be that more and more and more of these people would group together. The establishment of a forum or of a community or a professional association that was looking at games, but particularly from the kind of socio-cultural lens that we take in serious play, I think is much needed and would be very welcome. In terms of the serious play team, about this time last year, as we were approaching the last year of the project, because it's a mid-year to mid-year project, we thought about where next, and we thought about whether we should put our own focus into doing a follow-up project from serious play. And the members of the project team talked about this at length. In the end, people felt that the issues that were presenting themselves as needing attention, and of course that's what research projects are trying to do, is to kind of address where there's a new space emerging and what needs to be foregrounded and where there are potentially ambiguous or problematic things. And at that time, there was a great push in both Victoria and Queensland for, and I imagine elsewhere in Australia, but for a move towards bring your own devices to schools. And many people in the project team felt that there were a whole set of issues around the ways in which people use these devices, but also issues of equity and opportunity that hadn't been thought through. So the thinking at that time was that those energies and priorities that had driven serious play, which is more broadly is about ways in which we work with kids' digital worlds in ways that really enrich learning. That the most pressing issue there, paradoxically, wasn't with games, at least for the moment. The most pressing issue was how to explore and how to document and think through some of the implications for bringing your own devices.